Today's conversation is brought to you by the Ethiopian Evangelical Churches Fellowship in North America. The Journey to Jubilee event, which will be held in Washington, D.C., July 26th through 27th, will bring together about 15,000 Ethiopian Christians to celebrate 50 years of faithful ministry of EECFNA. This powerful gathering will include first and second generation diaspora leaders. Your organization can be part of equipping the next generation through sponsorship. Visit eecfna.org to learn more.
That's the real hope for me, is that we can come to understand that doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God is not something that we can just say and kind of think about as an idea, but that we can actually do it. And that does mean reckoning, that does mean reconciliation, that does mean restoration, that does mean truth-telling. And I'm inspired by many who have embraced that and like Bishop Grier, have taken steps to implement that.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. Today, we're joined by Bryan Stevenson, lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and Bishop Derek Grier, minister and founder of the National Unity Weekend. We're here to discuss the collaborative and sustained work of racial justice and reconciliation. Bryan, Derek, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you both on this podcast, and I'm grateful for this time together.
Glad to be with you.
Great to be with you.
As we get jumping into things, I want to do a little bit of an introduction, whether it's through your New York Times bestselling book, Just Mercy, or the movie by the same name. A lot of people are familiar with the inspiring nature of your story, your work, Bryan. As a young lawyer, you provided legal representation to those on death row, including to those who were later proven to be innocent, but also to people who have been unfairly sentenced. And you've also advocated on behalf of legislative changes. So the Equal Justice Initiative continues this work, but there's an increasing layer that has been added around education. And this is where the legacy sites come in. Can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of your journey?
Sure. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I started my education in a colored school, and what ended racial segregation and Jim Crow enforcement in the community I grew up were lawyers intervening who could enforce the rule of law. And so I was attracted to that when I grew up, and wanted to use that power lawyers have to protect the disfavored, the marginalized, the excluded, the shunned, the imprisoned. And that did shape the early part of my career. But in the last 15 years, I've begun to worry that our nation has shifted in a way where I'm not sure we could win Brown today. I'm not sure we could actually rely on the law to protect the rights of disfavored people. And that's what pushed me into wanting to get outside the courts and engage in what we call narrative work. And the legacy sites that we've created are really an effort to engage people in conversation and understanding and reckoning with history, because I think that's such a critical part of how we get to a healthy relationship with one another, a healthy relationship with our community, a healthy relationship with the people around us, and I think a healthy relationship with what it means to be a person of faith. And so it's been exciting to be pushing in this new area, and that's really the genesis behind the creation of the legacy sites.
There's a lot in what you just shared that I'm going to tease out in our conversation, but I want to swing back to you, Derek. You're senior pastor of Grace Church in Dumfries, Virginia, but you've also founded this movement, National Unity Weekend, and we at the NAE have been glad to partner with you in that. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to start this National Unity Weekend.
Very good. Thanks, Walter, for having me. It's great to be in conversation with you and Bryan, and I'm looking forward to all that we discussed today. Back in 2021, this was around at the height of Black Lives Matter. I was a little frustrated. I watched television And folks that look like me were primarily venting, and folks that were the majority culture seemed to be doing a lot of deflecting. And I'd ask myself, are there any grown-ups in the room? Where are the grown-ups? Who are the folks that are going to reconcile this thing, bring it together so we can move forward? With that, in my prayer time, I felt like the Lord was saying to me, hey, you could do what God's given me to do using the resources I have. Let me put it better. I felt like he was saying to me, bring folks together. But with that said, I reached out to friends. I really, I'm super busy. We were in a building project. Didn't really have time for anything new. In fact, when you're in the middle of a building project, you really don't want to do anything that could be misconstrued. So with that, I took some steps and I reached out to friends, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different denominations, and say, hey, do you think this is something that the Lord really wants me to do? And they all said yes. So from that, I created something called the Statement of Change, where in that statement, you can't get past the problem until you admit a problem. So I created a document where we state, hey, the church has made some mistakes in the United States. And then I found folks that had a lot to lose by signing that document, actually signed that document. So to me, that was another clue. And it just progressed and snowballed. And it really just started with a bunch of friends. And then by last year, 2023, we took the step of asking churches across the country to preach from a shared text to illustrate unity. But also that weekend, we want churches, and actually that weekend, and so it's already done. It's going to be done again this year. But what we were doing is asking churches to not only preach about racial healing and reconciliation. How about if our churches got together and we united across denominational, racial, and ethnic lines and began to serve together underserved communities? It's an opportunity for churches to speak into racial healing from a biblical perspective, also to be the hands and the feet of the gospel. And we were surprised by the response last year. Over 100 churches across 25 states in the district. And it was absolutely amazing. This year, we're expecting even a greater response. And one of the things we do is we don't just talk about it, we try to be about it. So the reason we went down to Bryan Stevenson's museum there was actually Bernice King recommended it to me a couple of years ago, and I just couldn't find the time. But then he introduced the two of us, and I will tell you, Bryan is one of the most gracious men I have met. Everything that we did there was free of charge. I mean, he has bills to pay and all the rest, but just incredibly gracious. His staff was incredible. So we took folks down there, not just to talk about it, but really to experience history and to kind of connect the dots, because he takes us from slavery to mass incarceration. A lot of folks don't quite know how to connect the two. But if you go to the museum, you will have a new understanding of how we kind of got to this moment that we're in today.
Thank you, Derek. It really was a powerful visit. So the NAE partnered with the National Unity Weekend to bring together about 100 Christian leaders from a various set of backgrounds to visit this museum. Bryan, when you formed this museum, I've heard language of education, truth telling that you've talked about, recovering narratives, things that law can't accomplish and may decreasingly be able to accomplish. When you're putting yourself in the visitor's shoes, what are you hoping for them as they take this journey, as Derek's talked about? What is it that you're hoping people experience?
Well, I mean, the first thing, in particular for people of faith, I'm hoping they'll come with an open heart and with a desire to learn. I mean, we live in places all over this country that are so burdened by our history of racial injustice. There's no place in America you can go with that long history of bigotry and violence and discrimination and racism hasn't created a kind of corrupt environment. It's the toxins in the air. And we have to kind of navigate all of these contaminants that make it so hard for people to trust one another, to hear one another, to see one another. And I don't think institutions have done very much to help people manage that. If anything, we've kind of said, just ignore it, or you can get through it. But any environmental threat is a threat we have to understand. It doesn't matter how committed you are. If you're breathing in air that is not healthy, it's going to affect your ability to kind of see and do the things that I think we're called to do. And so we just want people to come into this space and, yes, first learn, because we don't know this history. It has not been a priority in most educational institutions to talk honestly about this legacy, because a lot of it is painful and difficult. But secondly, to appreciate that there is a way forward. As challenging as the history is, we take you through eras where we make a way forward. There were 10 million Black people enslaved in this country. They were in bondage. They were humiliated. They were violated. They were abused. They were separated from their children and loved ones. They endured hardships and pain and agony, unlike anything most people could appreciate. And yet they endured, and they found a way to love in the midst of sorrow. And that part of the story is important to kind of elevate, because without it, you don't appreciate the gift that they gave their children. And instead of rewarding them for their perseverance, we did some horrible things. We disenfranchised them. We didn't hold to the promises we made at the end of the Civil War, and people were lynched and subjected to racial violence and had to flee lands that they owned. And yet again, they continued to struggle forward. And then we move into the civil rights era, where all kinds of people, including many people of faith, saw the harm created by this kind of bigotry, saw that this could not be reconciled with what God calls us to be and to do. And they joined together, and we made progress again, and we broke down the architecture of legal apartheid and Jim Crow segregation, and we moved forward. And the kind of work that Bishop Grier is able to do is a product of that effort that took place 2 generations ago to break down some of these barriers. But yet we are still struggling. And the period that he described in 2020 and 2021 is manifestation of that. And so there's a need to keep pushing forward. And so we talk about the contemporary issues today and the way in which we continue to be tolerant of bigotry and discrimination. And so that's the knowledge part of what we present as what we want people to experience. But the other part relates again to what Bishop Derrick just said, is the willingness to then say, as people of faith in particular, we erred, we fell, we did not do what God calls us to do during much of this history. And an openness to say, yeah, that was wrong. That should not have happened. That is not something we should be proud of. That is something that we must correct, address, reckon with. For me, that's the other thing that comes with this. People of faith, we've learned that we are not defined by sin. We are not condemned by our mistakes. We are not bound by the misjudgments, the actions we took that were not rooted in something helpful. We're not defined by that. We can be liberated from that. But there is this process of repentance and acknowledgement that we have to go through to then get to what many of us call salvation, what we call liberation, what we call transformation and redemption. And I believe that's true for everybody. And I just think a lot of that awaits us in many parts of this country. And we haven't been encouraged to think about our history and the history of our institutions from that vantage point. And I'm hoping that these legacy sites that we've created can inspire that kind of thinking. That's the real hope for me, is that we can come to understand that doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God is not something that we can just say and kind of think about as an idea, but that we can actually do it. And that does mean reckoning. That does mean reconciliation. That does mean restoration. That does mean truth-telling. And I'm inspired by many who have embraced that and like Bishop Grier, have taken steps to implement that.
Yeah. Bryan, let's take a step back and give our listeners just the layout of the museums. We say sites. Some may have visited, but visited at a point when it was just one site. So describe what are the elements of that.
So the journey really begins at the Legacy Museum, which is the kind of the central space where we present the history beginning with the transatlantic trade of enslaved people from Africa, 13 million people trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean. And we have a lot of content that helps people understand what that represents and how that shaped not just the American South, but all of the United States. It was ports in New England and in New York and Maryland and New Jersey that was a key part of that era. And then we get into the domestic trade and how enslavement moved to the American South. And then, of course, all of the violence that generated. We go from there to a discussion about racial violence and lynching following emancipation, to a discussion about the civil rights era and the courageous efforts of those to break down the architecture of Jim Crow and segregation, to a discussion about contemporary issues of over-incarceration. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In 2001, the projection was that 1 in 3 Black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. The projection for Latino boys is 1 in 6, and that's not widely understood or widely examined. And we think that that does reflect parts of this history that have not been acknowledged. So that's the museum, which pulls it all together. We then have a reflection room that honors 400 people who have fought the fight and have stood against this kind of inequality that we think reflect Micah's commitment to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. And then we have an art gallery to help people understand that there's a role for art and creative content in overcoming these things. The second site is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is dedicated to over 4,000 victims of racial terror violence. These are lynching victims. Between 1877 and 1950, thousands of people pulled out of their homes, beaten, tortured, drowned, lynched, sometimes on courthouse lawns. And we wanted to give name to all of these largely unnamed people. Most people in America, if you say name one Black victim of lynching violence between 1877 and 1950, they can't call a single name. That's how much we have avoided addressing this part of our history. But it was so critical because 6 million Black people flee the American South during the first half of the 20th century. And the demographic geography of many of our communities today are largely informed by and shaped by that era of terror violence, pushing people to places like Detroit and Los Angeles and Cleveland and Chicago and New York and Minneapolis and Boston. And so that site gives people an opportunity to get closer to that history and to see what communities are doing now, because we have a community remembrance project where communities are actually invited to memorialize and to erect markers at lynching sites in their communities. And we've done this in Virginia and in Maryland and places all over the country. And then the new site, Freedom Monument Sculpture Park, has a deep engagement with the history of slavery that uses art and sculpture to animate and dramatize the anguish and brutality of slavery, but also the dignity and the beauty of enslaved people who found a way to love, to find faith. The strong faith tradition that exists in the African American community was largely born out of this experience of enslavement and violence and suffering. And as we read in the scriptures, we know that God has a special heart for those who are oppressed, those who have been denied equality and full humanity. And that is expressed at this site as well. And we try to honor those that have given us so much. I'm the heir of people who were enslaved in this country. And so we've created this monument with the names of all 4 million people who were emancipated after the Civil War. And those last names that are now on that monument represent tens of millions of people who walk our streets and lands today. And we just wanted to have that space to acknowledge. I think God calls us. We know in the church that we acknowledge and honor those who have created opportunities for freedom and belief and faith and liberation for us. And we wanted to do that collectively. So there are 3 sites, the Legacy Museum, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and now the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park.
It's deeply biblical to build memorials. I mean, we're seeing that story being retold. The very fact that there's a story that was captured and told in scripture, millennia-long story, but then part of that story included building memorials, putting stones together to remember events. It's a profound reflex that seems to be deeply human, but also particularly biblical. I want to draw that part of your story out a little bit. the museum is not a Christian museum per se, but there's so many stories of faith and resilience. And you've already talked about your own faith as informing some aspects of your work. Draw that out a little bit more for us.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you acknowledging that, Walter, because I do think throughout time, making tangible our belief, our faith, what shapes us, what informs us, has been very much central to the Christian tradition. And you can go all over the world and walk into spaces that were built by people of faith centuries ago and feel something and see something and experience something. And I think reckoning and truth-telling does benefit from having a place to go, a place to touch. Journeys are an important part of how we move through life. And so creating a space where people can sojourn. A lot of people say, well, why don't you put these sites in Washington? Put them someplace that's... And I actually feel like there's some value in being purposeful about going someplace you might not otherwise go, taking a trip you wouldn't otherwise take. And that's consistent with what we read in the Gospels, where Paul went all across the lands and went to the people in Corinth and went to the people in different parts to minister and to serve. And, Jesus tells us to go into all the lands. And so that idea is very much a part of what I think is important about going to a place that has authenticity. And here in Alabama, we are on lands that we're at the center of the trade of enslaved people. Montgomery had one of the largest enslaved populations in the American South before the Civil War. We were the site of a lot of that trafficking. And then it continues on through history. And so when we bring people here, we're able to kind of show them things about the people. And for me, it's important that they hear first-person narratives. Again, what moves us so much when we read the scriptures are hearing stories about different people. And we use that approach in our site. And so when you come into our museum, you'll hear from people who were enslaved and they're awaiting auction. And we took narratives written by enslaved people and dramatized those. And you hear the voices. You hear people singing. You hear people worried about their children. In Era 2, you hear stories of people who survived near lynchings or who had to talk about seeing their loved ones pulled away. In Era 3, we talk about people and the things that they were trying to do to advance justice, people of faith trying to advance justice, people who would put on their Sunday best and go places and get on their knees and start praying for justice and equality and get beaten and bloodied and battered while they prayed. And you'd hear them talk about going home and wiping the blood off and changing their clothes and going back and doing it again. And sometimes that kind of testimony is essential and understanding God's power to liberate, to push, to pull. And even in Era 4, it's the voices of many of our clients who were wrongly convicted, who were sentenced to die in prison as children, who were told at 13 that they're beyond hope, beyond redemption, beyond the possibility of change at 13. And to kind of pick up a phone that kind of simulates the experience of going to a prison and listen to these people talk, young people and older people. For me, it's really important. I come from a church tradition that was very much about the word, the testimony, the living witness of believers and people who are persevering. That's how we find faith, is in the stories of others and the testimonies of others. That's what we find when we read the scriptures. It's the stories and the testimonies. And I think that's a powerful way to engage everybody, but certainly people of faith, and to understand the opportunity we have to overcome this history, to be truth tellers, to get to truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and redemption, truth and restoration. And that's very much the way that we present content at our sites.
My own experience is that being there, it's not just a matter of education, it's a matter of empathy. There's things that are evoked that are way beyond what a number or an abstract argument can make. When you hear a person's story or when you see it written out with a display, I found myself imagining what I would feel like if my two children were pulled away from me. It was impossible for me to navigate that space and leave it just with information and argument. It was now a human story that evoked empathy outrage, compassion, heartbreak. It was not a neutral experience. It evoked something profound that, in the end, I sense an activation as well, kind of activating us toward, well, I can't remain in this space. I need to do something. And so clearly the design worked on me. There was something quite compelling that was going on there.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear you say that, because I do believe that we have to be actors. It's like what Bishop talked about earlier, is that we can't just sign something and then go on. We've got to be active. And I think that's what God is calling all of us to do. I mean, what motivates me more than anything are the stories of the people who stood when they were told to sit down, who spoke when they were told to be quiet, the believers who risked their lives to act on faith, to create the kind of opportunities that they believed were needed. And I agree with you. It has to be more than knowledge. It has to be more than information. It does have to be empathy. It just has to be calling. And that's why I've always believed that it's not the ideas in our mind that will motivate us to do the things that are just. It's the conviction in our heart. And how our heart responds is so key to what our bodies will do, what our communities will do, what our institutions will do.
So it seems like there's all these compelling reasons for us to be pursuing this work. Yeah. And yet there are barriers. What do you see as some of the main barriers to racial reconciliation in our country?
Yeah. Well, I think it's fear and it's power. I mean, unlike a lot of countries that have had to reckon with histories of horrific human rights violations, there has been a change in power that has facilitated a lot of that reckoning. So in South Africa, after the collapse of apartheid, a Black majority took over. They were going to create a new political order that would insist on truth-telling about the problems of apartheid. In Germany, the Nazis lost the war, and the Allies insisted on some reckoning with that horrific history of the Holocaust. And you see amazing transitional justice in both of those countries. In Rwanda, after the genocide, there was a shift in political power, and that facilitated the kind of genocide museum that you see there. In the United States, there's never been a shift in power. The people who benefited from enslavement largely stayed in power after the Civil War. They were able to control and shape the social order, the political order, the economic order. Those who were victimized by lynching were never restored. Those who perpetuated that violence were never held accountable. Even during the era of Jim Crow segregation, we took the signs down, but the people who created those signs and benefited by the exclusion that they practiced for most of the 20th century were never held to account for that. And so there hasn't been this kind of necessary compulsion to reckon, to repent. And that's why Dr. King and so many others had to use a kind of a moral force, the gospel, the conviction. And that's what I think we're relying on today as well. And so I think that's the big challenge we face. Many people of faith don't think like they have to reckon with this history of racial injustice. No one's going to force them. And that's why they have to be compelled. And the reason why I think the church has such a critical role to play is because, like any sin, it will hold you back. It will burden you. People tend to think of, not telling the truth and not confronting the hard things as an easier way to move forward. And what we learn is that ultimately it's a harder way, because it blocks us from peace. It blocks us from joy. It blocks us from love. It blocks us from community. We don't become the beloved community. We don't become fulfilled in the way that I think God calls us to be, wants us to be. And that's where I believe there's a need for real leadership, which is why this undertaking by NAE and by Bishop Grier and others is so critically important. No one's going to make this happen for us. We're going to have to make this happen because we believe it, we see it, we're called to it. And that's different than what we've seen in other countries that are trying to recover from these sorts of histories. But it doesn't make it any less achievable, in my view. The church can and has been at times voices of repentance and redemption and restoration. And I think on these issues of racial justice, that's going to be key.
I love how you address the question of the barrier by directly speaking to some of the challenges, but you embedded it in a larger aspiration. It's not just about retribution or, somehow a return of violence against violence. You've used language of a beloved community, of being liberated from sin, freed from sin, to experience redemption. I mean, these are very positive aspirations.
Oh, I absolutely, and my my faith and the evangelical background that shaped my point of view is one of the lion laying down with the lamb. It's the joy, it's the beauty, it's studying war no more, it's turning swords into plowshares. It's the promise of the greatness that comes when we are unburdened by hate, when we are unburdened by bigotry, when we are unburdened by the things that keep us apart. And I want that for everybody. And for me, it is kind of rooted in an aspiration for joy and for peace and community and love. That is what motivates. It's not to just fix the harm and to get payback. And I don't want, I don't want that. I want restoration, but I know that we can't avoid talking honestly about the harms. For me, that's key. But yes, you're absolutely right. What animates my work and what motivates me is a desire to see the kind of liberation, the kind of transformation that happens when people are unburdened by bigotry and hate, when they're no longer blinded by these histories that can cause us to not see the full humanity of others in ways that we're not even conscious of, we're not even aware of until we begin to understand all of these forces that have shaped and constrained us.
So I'm going to bring the church leader into the conversation. Derek, what are both some of the barriers, maybe a main barrier or two, but what are the aspirations when it comes to racial reconciliation?
Yeah, I think Bryan said it well. There can be no reconciliation without first reckoning. And, it's painful to look at history. But if we're going to learn from history, we do have to look at it. And that's the only way we're going to learn from it. So I think for a lot of folks, it's just a painful subject, and they'd rather not look at it. However, if we're going to get past it, we do have to look at it. And the hope is, it's the whole message of Christ, that he suffered unjustly. But on the third day, he was raised from the dead. God can, the worst day of your life doesn't have to be the final day of your life. The worst thing that happens to you doesn't have to define you. And Jesus went through, and every Easter we talk about, Good Friday, we talk about what Jesus went through in order to celebrate what happened on Sunday. So, we got to talk about Friday to really appreciate Sunday. So the hope is that, as a nation, there's a greater willingness to look at where we've come from and have an eye toward where the Lord wants to ultimately bring us. And that's a nation, fulfills Dr. King's dream, where people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And that can happen as we are willing to humble ourselves. As you said, when you went into the museum, you couldn't help but think about your own children. And I think as we humanize one another, humanize the narrative, and recognize, there go I, saved for the grace of God, and we recognize that, other people's journey might be a little bit different than my journey, but if we love on each other, we are our brother's keeper, we can help our brother get to ultimately where we need to go. So the whole museum tour was just a great big reminder of history. And it was a great reminder of actually the power of God, because God has been so faithful to African Americans. He's been so faithful to America in general. And there's tremendous hope, particularly as we look to the gospel. And we really recognize that in Christ we are one. There's neither Jew nor Greek. Before God, he just sees human beings. And with that said, if we would really allow the gospel to speak to our thinking and our decisions, I think America would be a much better place.
I'd love to hear, as we draw this conversation to a close, I'd love to hear, in moments in which this work becomes a labor to you, or you may feel the temptations to ditch it, whether it's at EJI, or your work in this advocacy, whether it's in this prosecution, pursuing a case that seems so desperate, or it's in the church, and you think about all the things that you have to hold together when you're seeking to proclaim Christ, whether in the pulpit or in congregational life and your engagement in the community. So I'm drawing this because undoubtedly there are moments in which you feel, gosh, is this worth this? I could be doing something else with my life. Or what keeps you inspired, both personally, and what keeps you inspired about the possibility for the church to be engaged?
If I could go first, in the 1970 or so, there was probably under 200,000 people that were involved in the criminal justice system. Today, there's over 2 million. And 1 out of every 3, and that was already mentioned, African-American males in particular will be part of the criminal justice system at some point. So my congregation is about 80% African-American, 20% Hispanic, white, etc. Every Sunday, I am ministering to people and serving people whose children are exposed to life here in America. And with that said, it's not a theory to me. I raised 2 African-American boys, and, teenagers do teenager things. And my great concern was, if they ever get too teenagery and do stupid things, going to jail is not a minor thing. It's life-changing. It's not just about being behind bars. It's being in a culture of brutality. And the criminal justice system, I mean, it's a whole thing, and it's real to us because, again, we're more likely to be engaged in it. So when I look at, my sons, and even me, I'm originally from New York, New Jersey. I graduated in Jersey, but I grew up in New York. But I'll tell you one thing that kept me somewhat straight. I came close to some lines as a kid, but was Rikers Island. After you went to Rikers Island in New York, your life was different. Your life was changed. And the fact that, folks are talking about lock them up. I understand that, but, okay, I'm an evangelical. I believe all the fundamental doctrines that we find in Scripture. I happen to be pro-life. I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, but there's really no but to it. But when I look at it, when we vote and we look at other issues, what weighs heavily is the fact that I have 2 African-American boys, and these African-American boys are more likely to be locked up, and folks are talking about lock them up. And our community suffers the most, from slavery to, convict leasing to Jim Crow and all the rest. There's just been a long line of stuff that has impacted the African-American family. And as a pastor, that's who I'm in front of every single week, the African-American family largely. And I can't get away from some of the disparities in our justice system. So I think it's vital for us to begin to address these issues. I'm really not, I'm not angry. God has blessed me. He's been incredible. I'm not mad at white folks. I'm just concerned about our babies. I'm concerned about our young men. And it's vital that we make sure our young men have, African-American young men have as much of a chance to become part of society, a helpful part of society than any other group. And with that said, we got to look at how we got here in order for us to find ways to move forward. So what drives me again is my own personal background, my children, my congregation. It's not theoretical to me. These are folks I love. These are folks I visit in prison. These are young men that I've seen in church on Sunday, but then later I have to visit them in prison for various reasons. So it's not an abstract issue. And what keeps moving me forward is really just being connected to folks, African American folks, and just being aware of what's happening in our community. And perhaps Bryan can say that better than I said that.
No, I think, for me, I do see the reality of injustice. I grew up in a community where most of the adults didn't have high school degrees, not because they weren't smart, not because they weren't hardworking, but because there were literally no high schools for Black people in our county when my dad was a teenager. People were burdened economically because of these limitations. For most of my career, I've gone into jails and prisons. I've seen people who've been wrongly convicted, unfairly condemned, unjustly treated, people who've been brutalized by a system that didn't care enough about their dignity and humanity to actually do the things you're supposed to do to make sure that this person has been properly convicted. And when that happens to people, there's a lot of anguish, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain. I've spent time with families, all kinds of families, disproportionately African American, as the bishop says, but many poor white families who have also been impacted by the harms that are created by inequality and injustice. I've seen what addiction and drug dependency has done in this country. And we had an opportunity in the 70s to treat that as a health problem, but instead we chose to treat it as a crime problem. We put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons because they were suffering from addiction and dependency. It wasn't informed, it wasn't smart, it wasn't spiritual, it wasn't biblical, it was angry. It was rooted in a kind of anger and fear. And when you see all of these things all the time, what motivates me is that I genuinely believe that something better is waiting for us. I think there is something that feels more like freedom, feels more like equality, feels more like justice. But beyond that, I think there's something that feels more like community, that feels more like health, that feels more like church in the beloved community sense. And I think that's what motivates me. And, Walter, you're absolutely right. You can't do any kind of justice work without encountering moments where you feel overwhelmed, where you feel intimidated, where you feel beat down. But as I get older, I am increasingly finding myself in conversation with elders, people who are not physically here, but their stories and their lives are speaking to me. And to know that my parents dealt with the humiliation of racial segregation, encountered all of those signs that were like assaults that created injuries and still found a way to love is deeply meaningful to me. To my grandparents, my grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life. And I've talked about how she still had this deep commitment to learning and reading, my enslaved great-grandparents. And I just think the power of their witness, of their journey, of their love insists that I embrace that and have that same opportunity. I'm less burdened than they were. And therefore, I feel like I have to be equally engaged in pushing. And the beauty is that I'm finding strength in that conversation and knowing that there are these witnesses all around us who have found a way to persevere, to do the hard things. We all stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. And for me, that's deeply meaningful in those moments when it feels like things are so heavy and so hard. And I am really leaning into that as I age. And the great thing about it is I'm beginning to understand why those old I grew up in a church where I was a musician, and I would play for the testimonial services, and I never understood why those older people would come in and sometimes have more joy, more energy, more spirit than anyone else. And, they'd lean back and start singing, "Wouldn't take nothing from my journey now." And I didn't always appreciate what was behind that, but I'm starting to feel it as I get older. And that for me is a blessing. So I'm grateful for the challenges and the opportunities that God has given and placed before me. And at times it's overwhelming, but I really feel privileged and blessed to be able to do what I do.
And Walter, if I may inject again, I think one of the other super encouraging things is the number of white people, Hispanic people, and Asian folks that are now members of our church. At first, you can't help but notice, the person has blonde hair, blue eyes, et cetera. But after a while, they're just a person. And as I see more and more folks that are of different ethnicities willing to worship God alongside me, be on this life journey with me, it has been super encouraging. And I have not seen this at any other point in my ministry. This is kind of something that's been happening over the last few years, but it's been super encouraging for people of faith to be able to get past, the various types of music that, one person claps on the on beat, the other person claps on the off beat, and to get past all that, to worship the same God and to live life together. And I've been super blessed by the privilege of serving white people, Hispanic people, people from Korea, China, as well as African Americans. And for them to call me their bishop every time I hear it come out of their mouth is absolutely heartwarming. And it's just a testament to what the cross can do in the lives of those that take Jesus seriously.
We've talked about justice, but there has been within this a lot of grace and truth. Our guests on today's conversation have been Bryan Stevenson and Bishop Derek Grier. I'm Walter Kim, and on behalf of us all, thank you, Bryan and Derek. The National Association of Evangelicals is where we use influence for good. Today's conversation is one of many ways we help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. To discover more NAE topics and resources for you and your church, please sign up for our email list and visit our resource hub at nae.org.